Okay, as we continue our exploration of the European world, we're going to take a look at the age of absolutism. To get us started, we're going to look at Louis XIV, the King of France. Let's start by taking a look at the theory of absolutism. Absolute monarchs believed in divine right. That's the idea that God created the monarchy and that monarchs acted as God's representatives on earth. So this was a main component of the theory of absolutism, that basically the kings were chosen by God to lead. Alright, now with the theory of absolutism in mind, let's take a look at how Louis XIV ruled absolutely as the King of France. First of all, Louis viewed the state and himself to be one and the same, so there was no distinction between the king and the state. The king was the state. And he was often heard saying the French phrase,
L'État c'est moi.
which basically meant, I am the state. So this was a common phrase for him to be saying, and it basically combined the king and the state together. So no longer was the monarch just an individual, but in fact he embodied everything that went with being the state. Louis also referred to himself as the Sun King. This was a phrase that referred to how great he was, considering that the sun is sort of a symbol of rays shining on everybody. He sort of saw himself in that same light. So again, this was a sort of a metaphor that he could use to talk about how great he was as king. Now, there are 5 easy steps to being an absolutist, and these are the same 5 steps that essentially Louis and other absolutists followed. But he sets up the model for everybody else in Europe who wants to be an absolute monarch by doing the same thing. So here are the first of the 5 easy steps, and that is having a large standing army. If you have a large standing army, essentially a full-time army, it may be costly, but you can then use that army to fight foreign wars, to protect your country, and also expand your power. Also, you want to have a centralized government. In this case, the government was centralized in the rule of Louis. In fact, Louis said, I am the state. So there was really no distinction between the centralized government and Louis himself. And even though he ruled with the support of nobles, he in essence, as the monarch, was in charge of the nobility. You also want to use theatrical display, and this was something that Louis was very good at. He played the part of the king very well. He dressed as the king, he acted as the king, he lived a very theatrical lifestyle, and of course by saying things like, I am the state, and promoting himself as the Sun King, those helped to sort of promote the image of him as a very important monarch. Also, you want to have efficient tax collection, and this is something that Louis was able to do. By using his finance minister, Colbert, he was actually able to collect taxes from a large percentage of the provinces of France. Now, he did this through what was known as tax farming. Basically, he relied on local nobles to collect the taxes for him. They would then send the taxes off to Paris, but they would keep a percentage for himself. Now, it may not seem like that's a good deal because you're not getting 100% of the taxes, but even if you're only getting 60% or maybe even 70% of the taxes, that's a lot more that you would be getting in Paris than you would have normally without the help of these tax collectors. So it did help to increase tax revenues, and of course those revenues went to the central government, which of course is Louis XIV, and that helped to make him a much more powerful monarch. He also had to have support from the nobility. He might have been able to rule above them as monarch and as the state and as the Sun King, but essentially without the support of the nobility, he wouldn't have been able to stay in power. The nobility in this case basically enjoyed living that lifestyle of being a noble with the king. In fact, many of them would spend time at the Palace of Versailles and spend time with the king and look for favors from the king. The king would help support them by giving them tax breaks, giving them more power, maybe even giving them a land grant. But in essence, they needed each other. The king needed the nobility, and the nobility needed him. But keep in mind, these are a small number of people, a very small percentage of the overall population. The majority of people living in France at the time were peasants, and they were being exploited by the nobility. Okay, the reign of Louis XIV. Let's look at his successes and his failures. Here's his successes. First of all, he ruled France for 72 years. That's a long time for any monarch, and as a result it created stability throughout France during the time that he ruled. Also, French culture, manners, customs replaced Renaissance Italy as the European standard. So if we go back to the Renaissance, we see that Italy was the place where the Renaissance had its birth. But by the time we get to the reign of Louis XIV, we see that French culture dominates most of European culture as a whole. So let's take a look at the failures. First of all, he fought a series of costly wars. One of the wars that we're aware of is the War of Spanish Succession. This was a war fought in Europe between 1700 and 1713, in which the King of Spain would have been chosen, and the question was whether he would be dominated by the French as a relative of the French, or would it be independent Spain as it had been prior to this time period? So Louis involved himself in this war. He also involved himself in other wars, like the French and Indian Wars in North America. So many of these wars were very costly to fight, not just here in Europe, but also in the Americas as well. So that ended up taxing heavily the revenues of the government and made it a burden for France in the long term. So during Louis XIV's period, he fought these wars, but by the time we get to Louis XVI, the cost of these wars had become a huge burden for France, and in fact was one of the reasons that sparked the French Revolution. So again, the French Revolution's origins go all the way back to Louis XIV, even though it impacts Louis XVI. We also have the persecution of Huguenots. Huguenots are French Protestants. So this is right after the Reformation, and what we have at this point is a significant portion of the population of France practicing Protestantism. But Louis XIV was a Catholic and remained a Catholic and made France a Catholic nation, and therefore they were persecuting the Huguenots during this time period. And as a result, you had religious conflict and strife in France. Okay, we should also take a look at this too. This is the splendor of Versailles. The Palace of Versailles had originally started off as a hunting lodge, but eventually by the time of Louis XIV, he had expanded it to an enormous size. So this painting here shows a very early painting or image of the lodge, we might call it, in its early years, but it grew to be much, much larger over time. Now essentially, if we look at all the different things that are going on here, you can see that the gardens at Versailles were quite large. 15,000 acres of gardens, lawns, and woods, 1,400 fountains. It says here that it took so much water to run the fountains at the same time that it was only done on special occasions. And on other days, when the king walked through the garden, servants would turn on fountains just before he reached them to conserve water, and then the servants would turn them off after he walked away. The main building itself is about 500 yards in length, and it has about 2,000 rooms in it. Now, the estimated cost at that time would be about $2 billion in 1994 dollars. That's a lot of money. And it required 36,000 laborers and 6,000 horses just to work on building this palace. And in fact, it actually has two other wings that extend from each side that are 150 yards long. Today it's a museum, but it's a magnificent building. In addition, you should consider the fact that Versailles is a monumental piece of architecture, contributed to Louis's status as the Sun King and his theatrical displays of wealth and power. And again, this idea that you would build giant palaces like this as symbols of your power would be emulated by other monarchs later on in the future, people like Peter the Great.